The station master stopped asking her to leave on the third night. Before that, he'd paced the platform at dusk, his boots scraping frost from the planks, reminding her that the westbound train wasn't coming today. Maybe not tomorrow, and surely not for someone like her. But Eleanor stayed. She sat beneath the cracked timetable, her wedding dress hidden beneath a patched brown coat, her only bag tucked beneath her knees like a fragile secret. The first 2 days, she had hope. By the third, hope had soured into something colder. Stubbornness, maybe, or plain survival. She hadn't eaten since Tuesday. She didn't dare sleep long, fearing she'd miss the man she'd been promised to. A stranger who'd written letters, calling himself Everett Cole, saying he'd meet her here at this forgotten rail stop on the edge of nowhere. He hadn't said much else, just his name and a promise. "I'll come for you." 5 days later, the wind still mocked her, tossing grit across the rails, howling through the hollow freight cars like ghosts with unfinished business. The townspeople barely noticed her anymore. Some pitied her. Others smirked at the foolish girl waiting for a cowboy who probably wasn't coming. But Eleanor wouldn't leave. She couldn't. She'd already left too much behind. And then, as the sun bled into the 5th evening, she heard it. The slow crunch of boots against gravel, steady and unhurried. She didn't look up at first. She'd imagined footsteps before. But these stopped right in front of her. A shadow fell over her lap, blocking the dying light. She raised her eyes. He was taller than she expected, broader too, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat. A jagged scar cut from his left cheek to the edge of his jaw, like a story no one dared ask about. Dust coated his coat, his boots, even the faint line of his throat where the collar hung loose. But his eyes, steel gray and tired, met hers without pity, without apology, without a single word. Eleanor opened her mouth, unsure whether to curse him or cry, but he only extended a hand, rough and steady. She hesitated, the cold rising up her spine like doubt. And then she took it. He helped her to her feet without a smile, without explaining his lateness. Instead, he simply tipped his hat toward the horizon, where the road stretched wide and empty. And together, without a word spoken between them, they stepped off the platform and left the station behind. The road out of the station stretched like a scar across the plains, winding through brittle grass and fading daylight. Eleanor followed beside him, their boots leaving twin prints in the dirt, but not a single word passed between them. She stole glances at his face when she thought he wouldn't notice. The scar was worse up close, raw and uneven like it had been stitched in the dark. His jaw was sharp, unshaven, his lips thin and unsmiling. But his steps were steady, his pace matched to hers, and somehow that spoke louder than anything he could have said. After an hour, the silence became unbearable. "You're Everett Cole?" she asked, voice dry from days of waiting. He gave a single nod, eyes fixed ahead. "You got my letters?" she tried again. Another nod, slower this time. Frustration prickled her skin. "Why didn't you send word? I waited 5 days." He finally spoke, voice rough as gravel. "Couldn't." That was it. No apology, no excuse, just truth laid bare and simple. She bit back the anger building in her throat. "And now what? You ride me back to whatever ranch you've got? Claim me like a prize?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't look at her. "You ride beside me, not behind." The words startled her, colder and kinder than she expected. "And if I don't want to go?" she asked, testing him. He slowed, turning to face her fully. His eyes held something deeper than defiance, something like permission. "Then you stay here. I won't force you." The wind carried their breath away between them. Eleanor crossed her arms against the chill. And if I stay, what happens to me? He looked past her, to the dying sun bleeding across the horizon. Same thing that already happened. Nothing. The truth of it landed heavy in her chest. No one else had come for her. No one else was coming. She let out a long, tired sigh and adjusted her coat. Fine. But if I'm riding beside you, I'll need a horse. A flicker of something passed through his scarred face. Approval, maybe. He gave a low whistle, and from the ridge beyond, a dark mare trotted toward them, dust swirling at her hooves. He handed Eleanor the reins, his rough fingers brushing hers just once. Name's Mercy, he said quietly. Don't let her fool you. She bites. For the first time in days, Eleanor smiled. Maybe not all things that bite are meant to hurt. And in the fading light, they rode on. Two strangers bound by silence, searching for whatever came next. Night fell fast on the open plains, swallowing the road in darkness and cold. Everett stopped at a rocky outcrop beside a dry creek bed and began gathering wood without a word. Eleanor dismounted stiffly, her legs sore from hours in the saddle, but she didn't complain. Complaining hadn't helped her in 5 days at the station, and it wouldn't help her now. She watched him work. Efficient. Practiced. He built the fire small but steady, enough for warmth without drawing attention. When it caught, sparks drifted upward like fleeting stars. They sat across from each other, the fire between them, and for the first time since she stepped off that platform, Eleanor let herself breathe. "Where are we going?" she asked. Everett tore a strip of jerky and tossed it to her without answering. She caught it clumsily and glared. "You do realize a conversation takes 2 people?" He chewed his own piece slowly, then finally spoke. "North." She frowned. "That's not much of an answer." He shrugged. "It's enough for now." Frustration bubbled in her chest. "You sent me letters. Promises. I thought I was meeting a man ready to build a life, not a ghost." Everett met her eyes across the flames, steady and unreadable. "Life's not built in a day, or a letter." She hated that he was right. But still, 5 days alone on that station platform had carved something raw into her bones. She wasn't here to be dragged through another man's silence. "Why the scar?" she asked before she could stop herself. He froze. The wind hissed between them like a warning. She expected him to walk away, to shut her out the way most men did when reminded of their cracks. But instead, he answered, voice low and even. Made a choice. Paid for it. No more, no less. Somehow that was enough. She tore a bite from the jerky and sat back, the firelight warming her face. For a long while, they spoke no more, but the silence between them had shifted. It wasn't empty now. It was waiting. When the stars filled the sky, Everett pulled a worn blanket from his pack and laid it near the fire, closer to her side than his. She eyed it warily. "Trust me?" he asked. The question startled her, but after 5 days of waiting for someone to speak honestly, she found herself nodding. "I'm trying." He tipped his hat low over his eyes and settled into sleep. And beside the crackling fire, Eleanor finally stopped feeling alone. By midday, they rode into Dustwell, a town as tired as its name. The streets were lined with crooked signs and men who stared too long at strangers. Eleanor sat straighter in the saddle, her hand steady on Mercy's reins, though inside her chest pounded like a runaway train. Everett rode ahead, silent as always, but his presence carved a wide berth in the dusty street. Men nodded at him. Some turned away. Fear or respect? It was hard to tell the difference. They stopped outside the general store where the porch sagged under the weight of gossip and whiskey. Everett dismounted first and offered his hand. Eleanor hesitated, then swung down without taking it. She needed to stand on her own feet now. Inside, the clerk barely looked up. "What'll it be, Cole?" So they knew him here. Of course they did. Everett tossed a few coins onto the counter. "Flour, beans, coffee." He paused, then added, "And a second blanket." Eleanor felt the words land like a stone in her chest. Not a question, a quiet kindness. The clerk packed their supplies without small talk. When they stepped outside, Eleanor asked the question burning in her throat. "How many places know your face?" Everett adjusted the pack on his horse. "Too many." "And your scar?" she pressed. "Does it scare them or remind them?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tipped his hat low against the wind. "Some men carry scars. Some men carry guilt. I carry both." They led the horses toward the livery, passing townsfolk who whispered behind worn curtains. Eleanor caught fragments. "That's the girl. Married to a ghost. Poor thing." Rage boiled in her chest, hotter than the sun overhead. She stopped cold in the street and turned to face them. "I waited 5 days on that platform," she said, loud enough for them to hear. "Not one of you came to ask if I was hungry or freezing. Don't pity me now." Silence fell like dust. Everett watched her, something like pride flickering beneath his quiet gaze. As they left the town behind, Eleanor finally asked, "Why'd you come for me, Everett?" "You didn't have to." He looked toward the horizon, voice low. "Because I know what it feels like to wait on someone who never comes." The road stretched ahead, wide and unforgiving. But for the first time, Eleanor felt her own footsteps beside his. And maybe, just maybe, the waiting was over. The road beyond Dustwell narrowed through a canyon where shadows clung to the rocks like regrets. Eleanor rode in silence beside Everett, her mind tangled with questions he didn't seem ready to answer. But she was learning that not all answers came wrapped in words. By evening, they stopped at a dry riverbed, setting camp beneath a leaning cottonwood. Everett unsaddled the horses and built a small fire, while Eleanor fetched water from a stagnant pool nearby. She caught her reflection in the water's cracked surface, a girl who looked older than the days she'd spent waiting. Sitting by the fire, she finally asked, "Who were you before all this?" Everett wiped his hands on a rag, staring into the flames. "A man who owed too many debts." "To who?" "To the kind of men who don't send reminders." "Just bullets." The fire snapped sharply between them. She thought about the scar, the fear in Dustwell's streets, and the way Everett never looked over his shoulder, because he didn't have to. He already knew what followed him. "And what about me?" she asked softly. "Am I just another debt you're trying to repay?" He looked at her then, really looked, his eyes tired but clear. "Number, you're the first choice I've made for myself in years." The words hit harder than gunfire. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and let the silence stretch between them. Warmer now, softer. "Why did you promise to meet me?" she whispered. "I could have waited forever." Everett tossed a branch onto the fire, sparks scattering into the dark. "Because someone told me once that the loneliest people write the truest letters. Yours sounded like truth." She felt something shift inside her, something small and scared but beginning to trust. They ate in quiet companionship, the fire crackling low. As sleep crept close, Everett stood and checked the perimeter, his silhouette sharp against the night sky. She watched him, a scarred man guarding a woman he barely knew. Not out of obligation, but something deeper. Something like redemption. Before he laid down, he spoke one more truth, voice low enough that the wind almost stole it. "Tomorrow we'll ride west, past the canyon. There's a place where my debts don't follow. Eleanor smiled faintly into the dark. And what will we find there? He laid his hat over his eyes, voice soft but sure. Whatever we build with our own hands. For the first time, she believed him. Morning came with gold spilling over the canyon walls, casting long shadows where the past still tried to follow them. Everett saddled the horses in silence, his movements steady but slower than before, as if the weight of where they'd been lingered in his bones. Eleanor helped without asking, slipping the last of the dried beans into the pack, rolling the blankets tight. They'd learned each other's quiets by now. But as they mounted up, she noticed something different in his posture. A hesitation, barely visible, but there. "What is it?" she asked. He adjusted the rifle at his side, eyes scanning the distant ridge. The canyon splits ahead. One way leads to Birch Hollow, the other, back to the men I owe. Her heart stumbled. "And you're still thinking of going back?" He met her gaze, steady but torn. "Some debts don't let go until they're paid." Eleanor's voice sharpened. "And what about promises? What about the letters, the waiting, the road we've taken together?" The silence stretched sharp between them. Finally, Everett spoke. "You don't build a future by running from your past. I tried. It found me anyway." She felt the sting of those words, but didn't let them settle. "Then don't run. Face it. But not alone." He hesitated, his scar catching the morning light. "You'd ride into that storm beside me?" She smiled, small but fierce. "I didn't wait 5 days at that station to be left behind again." His laughter, soft and surprised, broke the tension like sunrise breaking frost. "Birch Hollow first," he said finally. "We need supplies, shelter, then we deal with what follows." They turned west, the horses kicking dust into the warming air. The split in the canyon faded behind them, but the choices lingered in Eleanor's mind. As they rode, a hawk circled overhead, casting fleeting shadows on the road ahead. She wondered how many roads Everett had traveled before this one, and how many he'd abandoned before finding the courage to bring someone along. By midday, the wind carried the scent of pine and fresh water, a sign they were nearing Birch Hollow. She caught his eye, and for once, his smile came without effort. "Close now," he said. "And after Birch Hollow?" she pressed. His voice softened. "We stop running." For the first time, the road ahead felt less like an escape and more like a beginning. Birch Hollow looked peaceful from the ridge, a handful of cabins tucked beside a wide stream, smoke curling gently from stone chimneys. But peace on the frontier was always borrowed, never owned. Eleanor could feel it in the stillness, in the way the townsfolk glanced at strangers with cautious eyes and unsaid questions. They rode in slow, Everett's hat low over his scar, her coat pulled tight against the morning chill. The blacksmith paused mid-swing as they passed. A shopkeeper froze with a crate in his arms. Even the stray dogs watched them from the shadows. Everett dismounted outside the feed store and helped Eleanor down without a word. He tied the horses loose, ready to run if they had to. "Stay close," he said, his voice rough but calm. "Birch Hollow's kind until it's not." Inside the store, a heavyset man with a silver beard greeted them without a smile. "Heard Cole was dead," the man muttered, sorting through a sack of oats. Everett dropped a few coins on the counter. "Not yet." The storekeeper glanced at Eleanor, his brow raising slightly. "And her?" "Not your concern," Everett said, flat and final. The man let the silence hang a beat too long, then bagged their supplies. "They're still looking for you, you know. Men from the south. Said they'll burn half the ridge to smoke you out." Everett took the supplies without blinking. "They've burned enough." They won't touch this place." Eleanor felt the weight of every eye on them as they stepped back into the street. She pulled at Everett's sleeve. "Should we keep moving?" He shook his head. "Number, we stand long enough to be seen. If we keep running, the story writes itself without us." They spent the afternoon patching saddlebags and tending to the horses. Eleanor mended a tear in Mercy's bridle while Everett cleaned his rifle beside the stream. It wasn't much of a home, but for a few quiet hours, it felt like one. That night, as they sat by a small campfire on the town's edge, Eleanor finally spoke the fear she'd swallowed all day. "What if they find us tomorrow?" Everett looked into the flames, his voice steady. "Then we fight tomorrow." She studied him, wondering how a man so scarred could carry so much resolve. "And if we fall?" she whispered. He gave a quiet smile, tired but true. "Then we fall together." And in that promise, Eleanor found a peace no town could give or take. The next morning broke sharp and clear, but with it came smoke. Not the soft, homey kind curling from chimneys, but the black, angry pillar of something burning beyond the ridge. Everett spotted it first, rising fast against the pale sky. His jaw tightened as he strapped the rifle to his back. "They're close," he said. "Too close." Eleanor stood beside Mercy, one hand resting on the mare's neck. "Birch Hollow?" "Number South Ridge," Everett said, scanning the horizon. "They're burning the way behind us, cutting off escape." She felt the cold rise in her throat. "So they mean to trap us here." He nodded, face carved from stone. "And force our hand." By midday, the town stirred with unease. Folks whispered outside the blacksmith, watching the smoke snake higher. The sheriff, a worn man with lines deeper than the canyon, approached them by the feed store. "This your trouble, Cole?" Everett met his gaze without flinching. "Mine and no one else's." The sheriff sighed, spitting into the dirt. "We've had peace too long to die for someone else's war. If you can take your fight outside town limits, I won't stand in your way." Everett gave a tight nod. "That's all I ask." Eleanor frowned, heat rising in her chest. "You're just going to let them come?" Everett turned to her, voice low but sure. "I've run enough. Time to end it." She took a step closer, her voice sharp. "And what if I don't want you walking into that alone?" He studied her, scarred and steady, then did something he hadn't done before. He smiled. Small. Honest. "Then ride beside me like you have since the start." Together they saddled up, gathering what little they owned. The townsfolk watched as they rode east of the hollow, where the land opened wide and flat, giving no shelter but the courage they carried. As they crested the ridge, the smoke thickened. Figures on horseback emerged through the haze, men dressed in black dusters, faces hard as stone, rifles glinting beneath the noon sun. Everett slowed his horse, resting a hand on his revolver. "Last chance to turn back," he said quietly. Eleanor straightened in her saddle, heart steady now. "I didn't wait 5 days on a platform just to quit now." He looked at her, pride flickering beneath the scar. "Then whatever happens next, we face it together." And as the wind howled over the ridge, the two riders met the storm with their heads high and their hearts already home. The first shot rang out sharp and cruel, splitting the wind like a blade. Everett fired back without hesitation, his rifle crackling against the cold morning air. Beside him, Eleanor gripped her revolver, her hands steady despite the storm of fear crashing inside her chest. She aimed at shadows in the smoke, pulling the trigger not for blood, but for survival. The riders charged fast and hard, their horses pounding across the plain, dust and ash swirling in their wake. But Everett stood his ground, firing with the precision of a man who knew there was no place left to run. One rider fell. then another. The third veered off, losing nerve beneath the hail of grit and fire. Eleanor reloaded with trembling fingers, counting each shot like a prayer. For a heartbeat, everything paused. The wind held its breath, the smoke thinned, and silence stretched across the ridge. Then the leader appeared. Broad-shouldered, face hidden beneath a black hat, his voice rolled like distant thunder. "You can't outrun what you owe, Cole." Everett lowered his rifle, his voice flat and cold. "I ain't running. I'm paying it back right now." The leader laughed, dry and bitter. "One woman beside you won't change your fate." Eleanor spurred Mercy forward until she stood beside Everett, lifting her chin toward the man who thought fear would win this fight. "Then you've never met a woman who waited 5 days for her life to start." The leader hesitated, just enough for doubt to creep in. That's when Everett fired. Clean. Final. The man dropped from his saddle like a crumbling statue, dust swallowing his fall. The remaining riders froze, their will breaking beneath the weight of what they'd lost. One by one, they turned and fled, leaving the ridge in a silence deeper than death. Eleanor lowered her gun, her breath sharp and ragged. Everett dismounted, walking to where the leader fell. He stood over him, scar catching the sunlight, and let the silence finish what the bullets had started. When he turned back, his face was tired but free. "It's done," he said simply. Eleanor slid from her saddle, legs trembling, but she crossed the distance between them without falling. "What now?" she whispered. He looked toward the open plain, where smoke no longer chased them. "Now we live without ghosts on our heels." And for the first time, the wind felt like a beginning, not a warning. Weeks later, the wind carried no smoke, only wildflowers bending beneath wide skies. The road behind them was dust and memory, but the road ahead stretched clean and waiting. Everett and Eleanor found a place beyond the hills, where no one spoke of debts and scars were only part of the man, not his story. They built a small cabin near a quiet creek, its roof patched with laughter and hard work instead of fear. The land wasn't much, just rocky soil, a fence in need of mending, and a sky too wide to tame. But it was theirs. Together they planted seeds, stacked firewood, and fixed the porch that creaked in the morning wind. And sometimes, when the stars burned bright, Eleanor would sit beside Everett on that porch, the silence between them warm, no longer a void, but a shared peace. One morning, as the sun spilled over the ridge, a train whistle echoed faintly in the distance. Eleanor smiled softly, brushing her hands against her apron. "Funny thing," she said, watching the steam rise far beyond the hills. "I spent 5 days on that platform waiting for a man to show up." Everett leaned against the porch rail, scar softened by the morning light. And when he finally did, he didn't say a word. She laughed, the sound free and full, no bitterness in it now. "No, but I guess I spoke enough for both of us." He crossed the porch and took her hand, rough and steady. "You ever regret stepping off that platform?" She squeezed his fingers gently, her voice quiet but sure. "Not for a single breath." They stood there, letting the breeze carry their quiet to places they'd never see. The world had tried to break them, and maybe it still would someday. But for now, they had a place that no outlaw, no ghost, and no memory could steal. A place where waiting was over, and living had finally begun. As the day stretched out before them, Everett tipped his hat toward the horizon. "Let's ride later, see what the next ridge looks like." Eleanor smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "Only if we ride beside each other." He grinned, small and true. "Always." And so they stepped down from the porch, side by side, leaving the shadows behind them and riding toward whatever story they'd build next. No longer waiting, but finally free.